Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is wonderful to see so many people in the audience today. And thank you for joining us for this year's Long U.S.-China Institute Distinguished Lecture. If you haven't attended one of our programs before, just to give you a quick intro to what the Long U.S.-China Institute does, we are a campus-wide research center focusing on various aspects of contemporary China and U.S.-China relations. Our programs are very interdisciplinary. Our affiliated faculty come from disciplines including history, economics, political science, sociology, law, and business, among others. We also regularly invite policymakers and members of the community to our events. But what joins all of us is our shared desire to understand and research contemporary China in all of its complexity and all of its nuance. The annual Distinguished Lecture is a cornerstone of that mission, and this year we are very honored to welcome Professor Yao Yang to campus to give tonight's keynote. Professor Yao's talk will be followed by a response panel, which will feature John Graham, a professor emeritus of international business and marketing at the Mirage School of Business, and Edel Solingen, who is a distinguished professor of political science and the Thomas T. and Elizabeth C. Tierney Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies. Before we begin, I'd also like to briefly acknowledge our partners for this event, the Peking University Alumni Association of Southern California, which is particularly meaningful given Professor Yao's nearly 3 decades at Peking University. We would like to acknowledge its president, Chen Yong, who also leads the Chinese University Alumni Association Alliance of Southern California, and the Chinese Union at UCI alongside our other campus partners. Now, to formally open the program, it is now my pleasure to invite Professor Bill Maurer, who is Dean of the School of Social Sciences, to introduce our distinguished speaker. So, Dean Maurer.
Thank you so much, Professor Baum. Happy New Year to everyone here. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all for tonight's distinguished lecture on behalf of the School of Social Sciences and the University of California, Irvine. Let me just say a few words about the Long U.S.-China Institute, which Professor Baum is the director of. The Long Institute really plays a vital role here at UC Irvine as a space for rigorous interdisciplinary scholarship and sustained dialogue on China and U.S.-China relations, work that is especially vital at this particular moment for reasons we all understand. And tonight's lecture and then conversation is also especially timely. As China looks ahead to its 15th five-year plan, debates around political economy, innovation, development strategy, and global orientation are once again at the center of scholarly and policy and public discussions. Just a couple weeks ago, the Long Institute hosted a small, closed-door conversation with Wang Huiyao, president of the Center for China and Globalization. And we're delighted that tonight's program brings these conversations into a public forum anchored by the scholarship of Professor Yao Yang. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Professor Yao Yang is currently Dean of the Yishui Hu Advanced Finance Institute at the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, where he leads research and academic programs focused on development economics, political economy, and institutional change. Before assuming this role, as Professor Baum just mentioned, he spent nearly 3 decades at Peking University, one of China's very top universities and a central intellectual hub for economic and public policy. And there he also was a dean, so he's sort of a glutton for punishment in the dean thing. A dean of the National School of Development and director of the China Center for Economic Research, helping to shape 2 of the country's most important hubs for economic scholarship and policy-relevant research. His leadership at Peking University has left a lasting imprint on generations of students, scholars, and policy makers. He's widely regarded as one of China's most influential economists. His research spans economic development, institutional economics, and other fields, with a particular focus on how domestic institutions and incentives shape growth strategies and external orientation. His work combines theoretical rigor with close attention to real-world policy debates and problems, and continues to influence how scholars understand China's economic trajectory. So again, tonight is a wonderful opportunity to engage with these issues with depth and clarity, and to do so that reflects the spirit of the Long Institute's commitment to rigorous analysis and open dialogue. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yao Yang.
Thank you very much, Dimar, and I also want to thank the Long Institute for inviting me here to have this interaction with faculty and students in the University of Irvine. This is my first time to come to Irvine. Of course, I've been to California for many, many times. It's so wonderful to come to UC Irvine. This is a young university, but it's becoming one of the greatest university in the US and also, for that matter, in the whole world. I talked with Anne about the topic, right? So she suggested that I talk about China's domestic issues, then continue on to talk about the implications for US-China relations and China's position in the world, right? So let me start with China's domestic issues. For outsiders and even for many insiders, this is really difficult to understand what's happening in China. What's the decision-making process in China? Why the government is adopting this and that economic policies? To me, and many actually foreigners ask me this question. Can you tell me what the Westerners have missed about China? I always say you have missed the role of the government, right? Particularly after 2018. So when we talk about China, we always start with 1978. We talk about the reform and the opening, right? To me, reform and the opening, actually, that period, right, ended in 2018, right? 40 years. Since 2018, China entered a new period, what we can call a new era, okay? So what does the government or the party do in this new era? The most important thing is to correct, at least in the minds of the decision makers, the mistakes we made in the reform and the opening period. I mean, no one is going to deny the success of that period, right? Without reform, without opening, China would not be able to get to what is today, okay? Just like Xi Jinping himself said, reform and opening was a critical step for the Communist Party in his recent history, right? So I have to put this first, right? No one wants to negate reform and opening. But to the party, there were many problems emerging from that period, right? Let me name several. The first one is corruption, right? Corruption is a problem in most developing countries, right? You go to any developing countries, you are going to get into some corruption, petty corruption, or in China's case, huge corruptions, okay? So it's funny, I thought corruption only started in Ming Dynasty because Ming Dynasty only charged really low taxes on people, right? So the government didn't have a lot of financial resources to pay its officials. So officials learn how to take money from ordinary people. But actually not. Actually, we can trace back until the Han Dynasty. That is when the Chinese state was built. then as an economist, I thought, oh, yeah, that's actually natural, right? Because we had a central state. The emperor was on the top. The emperor could not manage the whole country by himself, right? So he had to delegate the work to government officials. And then there is a classical delegation problem, okay? Government officials began to take money out of taxes or any other sources, okay? So corruption, may I say, is kind of in the blood of the Chinese, okay, right? So then Xi Jinping really wanted to eradicate the corruption in a short period of time. So that's why there's waves and waves of the anti-corruption measures, right? So you think about the recent wave, right? There were actually more high-ranking government officials who have been arrested than the first wave, okay? So that's one, right? Corruption. The second one is at least in the mind of decision makers, over financialization of the economy. Okay. I mean, this is one of the lessons the Chinese leadership has learned from the United States. All right. So at least in their mind, why United States industry has been hollowing out is because the United States has a huge financial sector that dominates the economy. So everyone wants to make a quick money. You think about the Harvard graduates, MIT graduates, and probably also graduates from UCI. Their first number one job is go to Wall Street, make quick money, right? So that's in the mind of the Chinese leaders. So China should not repeat what United States has done. Okay, so we have to de-financialization. So since the end of 2017, the government began a huge deleveraging program, okay, trying to get rid of this over-financialization. And later on, it also reduced the salaries of people working in the financial sector. Many of my friends' salaries were cut by 60% or even more, 90%, in some cases 90%, right? That shows how expensive they were before, right? The cut, okay? Then the housing sector, right? So the decision makers believe the housing sector was just too prosperous because it's too attractive, right? Also sucking resources. But then people want to buy apartments and do speculation, and companies want to do the same thing, okay? There's a funny story that one listed company in a year, its profit was actually smaller than the money it got from selling its buildings. Okay, so for decision makers, that's not right. Okay, we have to shrink the real estate sector. Okay, and also over marketization, I should say. I mean, the market economy has been critical for China's success, but in some areas, the markets are just too much. For example, in the educational sector, this private tutoring sector, right? Private tutoring is just common in East Asia, not just in China. You go to South Korea, you go to Japan, go to Taiwan, you found the same thing, okay? But in mainland China, the problem is particularly serious because that tutoring sector actually sets up a kind of a parallel system to the K-12 system. Okay, so you learn in the classroom, and after the classroom, you have to go to another class, basically parallel. Okay, that's also too much. Okay. So there is a campaign to get rid of those private tutoring industry. Okay, and another thing is this platform industry, right? Because they were so big, so powerful, and some of those owners began to feel they were so powerful they could mess with politics. Okay. That was not allowed. That was also, by the way, that's also what I found curious of why United States could stand people. I'm not going to name names, right? Those business guys to mess up with the elections. I just can't understand. And by my education from University of Wisconsin, I thought that's almost a crime, right? But in China, of course, that's not going to be tolerated because it's a one-part rule, right? So that's actually the reason of this campaign on the platform economy. It's not because the platform economy had a problem. It's because of the political forces, right? That sector was unleashing. Okay, I can name more and more. Okay. So over the last 7, 8 years, the party wanted to correct the law. Okay. So the aim is, at least spiritually, to go back to the 1950s, right? In the 1950s, PRC was just established, right? And there was just one objective, that is to build a strong China through building a strong industry, particularly heavy industry. And many people actually were caught upon by this vision, right? There's new China, independent China, a prosperous China. Many people actually returned from the United States to China, including Ken Jiechen, right? So the father of China's missile program, okay, from Caltech, right? So there's just one aim, and then the party organized all the forces to work toward that just one aim. And for today, what's this a single objective? That's actually written in the 15th five-year plan. Right? The 15th five-year plan is going to be announced very soon in the 2 sessions, the China's People's Congress. Okay, I think the middle of March. Okay, but we already know most of the contents. Okay, it listed a complete kind of a list of things that the country is going to do in the next 5 years. Okay, but you have to look at the top priority. Okay, the top 2 priority, to me, are the most important. Number 1, manufacturing sector. China's manufacturing sector is already huge. If you look at the output, China's manufacturing sector accounts for 35% of world total. What does that mean? It's actually twice the size, almost twice the size of the United States. Okay, it's actually the sum of G7. You can see it like this: U.S. is the sum of the rest of 6 countries, and China is the U.S. plus the other 6 countries. Okay, but with such a huge manufacturing sector, China's leadership is not satisfied. It wants to enlarge manufacturing sector. It's funny, when we had a meeting between American and the Chinese economists, American side asked, you always invest in manufacturing sector. That's why you have huge redundant capacity. You are exporting deflation to other countries, right? Then, the answer from the former government official is like this: why should the Chinese government stop? Because we have accomplished so much. we have done such a good job. The only thing we want to do is to double down on the road. Okay? So my guess is that in the next 5 years or 10 years, China's share of world manufacturing output is still going to increase. Because there's no sign that China will stop investing into manufacturing, and there's no sign for the United States to reindustrialize itself. Okay, if we look at American manufacturing value added in GDP, it's still declining. Right? In that sense, the United States is still deindustrializing, not reindustrializing. So that's why I always calling the United States to open up the door to Chinese investment. Right? So if you allow Chinese companies to invest in your country, then Chinese companies are going to help the United States to reindustrialize itself. I mean, the table has been turned around. Okay, China has occupied the bulk of at least the median level of the whole industries. Okay. Number two, China is going to invest heavily into high-tech industries. Okay. So for the first time, the government document proposed that China is going to do 0 to 1 innovations. This is the first time, right? Because I think in the past, Chinese leadership and most of the Chinese didn't believe that China had reached the frontier of technology. But this time, at least for the leaders, they are quite confident. Now China is at the forefront of many technologies, and China has to do 0 to 1 innovation. Okay, and for the first time, the official document proposed what should I translate this? Self-reliant technology. Okay, so we're going to develop our own technology that does not depend on any country. All right. I think the objective is by 2035, China is going to build up a complete and self-sufficient technological ecosystem. That's the objective. Okay. So with that objective, the party wants all the companies, all the people, no matter which sector you work in, to work toward just one goal. That is a high-tech supported China. Okay. And this then comes to the U.S.-China relations. U.S.-China relations is the most important bilateral relations in the whole world. It's so critical for China, and I think it's also critical for the United States. Okay, but from the China side, China has to win this technological competition with the United States. Okay, the most recent near future objective is actually Taiwan. Okay. I always tell my American friends, reunification of mainland China and Taiwan is a fact. It is a fact. Okay, you have to treat it as a fact. Okay, because the Chinese government has set up, in the past, set up 2 centennial goals. The first one is to become a well-off society. We realized this by 2021. Okay, we eradicate poverty. And the second centennial goal is to build a strong, modernized socialist country. That's called China's national rejuvenation. And the reunification has to be part of China's national rejuvenation. Okay, I think that's so firm in the Chinese leaders' mind. That's a fact, right? And You cannot talk about, oh, whether conditions are met or not. No, that's the priority. Then you think about how to reach that goal. And for China, from China's side, the critical thing is that the United States has to agree. Okay? And how to make the United States agree on this? You have to build a strong military. The logic is so clear, right? So that is, if a peaceful reunification is impossible, China is going to use force. 100% sure. Okay, that if the peaceful reunification is not an option anymore, I believe in 10 years' time, China will use force to take back Taiwan. Okay, and it's critical that China fends off American intervention. Okay. How to do that? You have to build a strong military, and how to build a strong military? You have to develop your manufacturing sector. You have to develop high-tech industries. That's the logic. Okay, so that's why I say the U.S.-China relations now is so critical for China's domestic policies. Okay? But I still remain hopeful. So I want to end with kind of a more optimistic note. So the two presidents are going to meet at least twice this year. In April, President Trump is going to visit China. And in the fall, President Xi is going to return a visit. First attending the G20 meeting in Mar-a-Lago, a state visit. I think that there will be a state visit in Washington, D.C. Okay. So with at least those two meetings, probably United States and China can strike some kind of deal. I think there are three scenarios. At the minimum, the two countries will reach an agreement to stabilize the bilateral relations, which means the two countries are not going to increase export control. Okay, export control is not going to help either country. Okay, United States can what we call 卡脖子. You can how to translate that? Choke China, and then China on the other hand can choke the United States. Okay, so choking is not going to work for either side. Right? So I think that's the minimum, and no more fighting between the two countries on economic fronts. The median, kind of a middle scenario, is that the United States open the door to China's investment. So Chinese companies can invest into the United States, including the so-called sensitive sectors like EVs, like batteries, right? All sorts of things. And the best scenario is that the two countries reach agreement on Taiwan for peaceful solution for the island, right? So if we can reach the best scenario, I think we are going to have peace for the two countries and for that matter for the whole world for the next several decades. Okay, so let me stop here, and I'd love to listen how you make comments on my speech. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Yao. I would like to now invite the response panel up. So, Professor Graham, Professor Solomon. Yeah. This way.
I'm trying to get the mic on. That do it? Okay. Thank you so much for everybody being here, and the Long Institute putting on this presentation. Your presentation was very interesting. My second question is, I'll get to, but my first question is, as you described the 5-year plan, you didn't really describe collaboration with the United States or the rest of the world. You described a very competitive approach to international relations. And that's makes me very uncomfortable. I was looking at statistics from World War II. And in World War II, between 60 and 80 million people died. One of the biggest populations that died were Chinese folks behind Russia. But I was looking for more, I was hoping to hear more about collaboration and less about competition. Anyway, that's my first response.
So how do we go, like, serially?
You go.
Okay, actually, I just wanted to take a minute to recognize Tang Beiji for organizing this event. Beiji was among the top graduate students our program ever had in decades, and intellectually rigorous, hardworking, and thoughtful. And she went on to have a very successful career in Beijing. I can't think of a better person to have here, linking, people like you and UCI. So we're very lucky to have her. Thank you, and welcome, Yao Yang. Actually, I'm going to start from something you said. My second question will also address very more specifically what my colleague just mentioned. But you said something about corruption. I wasn't intending to actually discuss that at all. But in my world, I think of corruption as not being in the blood of any particular people or nationality. Rather, I'd go with your colleagues in economics that have studied corruption over history and so on, and that understand that problems of corruption really are a derivative of bad institutions, and especially of institutional concentration of power. That's just a side note to your comment. And I will go back to the topic of institutions, because institutions matter for the long-term growth, and your talk was really pretty much about the long-term growth of China. And they're important guardrails against the concentration of power. One of your colleagues, Eswar Prasad, you may know him, he's a former IMF official, said recently at a Brookings Institution meeting that Chinese officials were busy at Davos trying to sell sort of the China model as the responsible multilateralist and free trader. And he said, just literally quoting, that it didn't work because there's a lot of distrust in terms of this institutional framework that I'm going back to. And that means lack of checks and balances. We're leaving some of it right here. Now, last week, the US administration was handed a Supreme Court decision that goes well beyond tariffs. And even an institution with individuals handpicked by this administration was able to tell the executive, you have overstepped your authority. you cannot rely on tariffs to coerce other countries. You cannot use coercion to do that. So my first question is if you can foresee a similar institutional development where both the US and China can restrain themselves from using coercion vis-a-vis other countries, because both are doing it. I'll stop there for my first question.
Okay, answer first. Okay. Thank you. Those two questions. For Professor Graham's question, yeah, I feel the same, right? The two countries should work together. That's a much better world. But we live in reality, right? The reality is that US-China is entering a period of competition. Okay. I think that the competition is just a fundamental. It's just, if you allow me, in the 1990s, when I was studying in University of Wisconsin, President Clinton wanted to engage China, right? Based on a belief that is, if we engage China, China will become more like us. A friend of mine working in MIT actually had a book titled just China will become more like us. Okay, that's kind of the belief. Okay, but by the time the financial crisis, many Americans began to realize it sounds like China is not becoming like us. So in 2010, I got the sense that United States and China one day will have a showdown, because the two countries fundamentally have two different kinds of political systems. Okay, that's a reality. There's no way for China to give up its own political system. Okay, so we live by our vision, right, of the world. Okay, and our visions about the world are different. Okay? So that actually determines the two countries where cannot escape competition. And that's a reality. Okay. As I said, I feel not comfortable about this too, but that's just something we have to accept. For Professor Solingen's question, yeah, I said, corruption is just like a brand. It's just because it has been so long in Chinese history, right? So many people just take it for granted. Even after 2018, when anti-corruption drive entering the 60 years, you still found so many people taking bribes. Okay? I just can't understand it, but that's the way of life. Okay? And that's also a fact. Institutions, yeah, I was educated. And I started institutional economics in University of Wisconsin. That's also why even today I cannot fully understand what's happening in the United States. Okay. All right, so that's a long story, but we're talking about China. I know Prasad very well. Yeah. So I also agree with him. China is not going to kind of influence the world. I don't think that's also China's intention. China's international ambition is quite limited. That is reunification. Okay, that's the almost only ambition reunification. Okay. And if you read the party's document, it says we are going to build a rule of law by 2035. We don't openly acknowledge now today in China, we don't have a rule of law, right? We have to go another 10 years to build up a rule of law. So it takes time. And I actually don't think institutions, how to put that? Institutions are man-made, okay? Right? Look at what's happening in the United States. We used to believe that the United States had the most robust institutions in the whole world. Look at today, okay? If the people in the office don't believe in institutions, then institutions are nothing, okay? Institutions are built on beliefs. So in China, my interpretation is that there are still many urgent things to do for the reunification. Okay, so we have to finish those things before we build a country with the rule of law. That's kind of what's going on in China.
Just real correction. One of the things we do at the Long Institute is we publish about every other year something we call the U.S.-China Barometer, and it compares directly the two countries on interactions and also a variety of characteristics. And I have to say, when we look at corruption, at least we're looking at the way the Germans measure it, Transparency International, China has been getting better as time has passed over the last 16 years of the Long Institute. On the other hand, the United States, I'm really looking forward to seeing how bad our grade will be this year. We've been averaging about a C. It's a 100-point scale, and we've been averaging a C, dip down into a D area, and obviously it's going to get a lot worse. And this is based on survey data around the world, trying to measure corruption. So I'm more optimistic about what's going to be happening in China with respect to corruption. But that's the way I think about it. We measure it over time, look at the trend lines. We also have written about that in journals as well. I'm really troubled, though, by this, the competition. I mean, Americans love competition. That's the essence of free enterprise, is things get better because of competition. But I guess I'm really disturbed about this issue of collaboration. We also measure and report in the U.S.-China Barometer collaboration, and we see collaboration between inventors. We look at U.S. patents. We see collaboration growing like this. And so I see collaboration there at the level of inventors working together, inventive teams. But I guess I'm upset really about a 5-year plan that doesn't include the idea of collaboration. I think that's going to be a big problem. I think collaborating with the United States, but collaborating with countries all around the world, your neighbors and other places as well. For example, around the South China Sea. So anyway, that's my question is, do you see any opportunities for collaboration with other countries, including the United States?
In some words, in some ways, my comments will basically be the flip side of what John is asking here, because you mentioned today that the competition part started in 2018. But most people I know, most people I read, China experts and so on, and in your own presentation at CSIS in Washington, D.C., you said that the competition actually started in 2010. You said that you foresaw the inevitable clash. In 2010, which is a view close to what in this country we call theories of international relations that frame US-China relations in terms of this Thucydides trap, this inevitable clash. These people are called neorealists, and I'm not one of them. Many people that are not, they think that agency matters. This is not a hyperstructural trap that basically makes US-China relations doomed for eternity. Agency matters, and I know that giant thinkers in China don't buy the hyperstructuralist trap. There are articles in Foreign Affairs, for instance, I'm sure you've read Wang Jizhe and others. So can you think of realms of cooperation between the US and China? Can we move beyond this really false theory that, theories are also created, like, you mentioned institutions are in the minds of people. Same for these theories, right? If you actually peddle the notion that we're bound to compete and we're bound to be adversarial, then you create realities like that. And I know many of our colleagues in this country have helped create that reality as well. So can we move beyond that way of thinking about international relations that can facilitate the kind of cooperation that John is trying to extract?
Collaboration has many forms, right? So in today's world, I think number one is that let's resume cross-border investment. Okay, so if we cannot do this, I really don't think there's a basis for any other kind of cooperation, right? Cross-border investment is just unnatural. We are not enemies. We haven't reached that stage, right? So why United States doesn't allow Chinese companies to invest into the United States, and also doesn't allow American companies to invest in China, right? That's a fundamental question. That's a number one question. If we can solve this problem, I think then we can talk about collaboration. I don't know, climate change is not on the agenda of this current administration. But supposedly we can also collaborate in WTO. The United States just sent a new ambassador to WTO and also a new chief economist to WTO. WTO can be reformed, and China and the United States can work together to work out some rules first. I think for WTO to be reformed, our two countries have to sit down and talk about the new rules. Okay, then we take those rules to WTO and ask other countries to join. Okay, so that. In a sense, the collaboration only follows competition. Right? And also competition is not that bad, right? Like the companies, like in the market, the companies compete with each other, but they also live in a same ecosystem. And those good companies actually are really good at creating an ecosystem with their competitors. Yeah. So that's one. For Professor Sullivan's question, I think that the thing is that for many Americans, okay, let me be frank, they don't accept the CCP regime. Okay, that's why the Chinese government, whenever they talk with American counterparts, they always talk about the three things. Number one, you never challenge our current political system. Okay, Number two, there is only just one China. Number three, China has the right to develop its own economy. Those three things. Okay. So that shows how important the political system is for China. Okay. And then most Americans actually don't accept it. I mean, you think of it in the Trump first term, right? The State Department, what was his name? Now I forgot his name. The Secretary of State, right? Pompeo spoke in Reagan Ivory, right? And the big government, I called for Chinese people to overthrow the Communist Party. I tell you, that was so serious to the Chinese leaders. Okay. In the past, in the 1990s, or even the first decade of this century, we didn't have all this because we had an underlying assumption that one day China would become a democracy. Okay, but when Xi Jinping came in power, he just sealed off that dream. China is going to go down the socialist road forever. Okay, so if the United States does not accept this, then surely there will be competition. This is good. The current administration doesn't care about political regimes. But I don't think that American intellectuals and other American politicians really don't care. Okay. Whenever they talk about China, they always say that's a dictatorship. Right? That hurts. That really hurts. Okay. So in that sense, we need to have more understanding, right? Only with that kind of understanding can we collaborate. Otherwise, I just don't see any hope for real collaboration between the two countries. Because look, you don't even accept my system. How can I collaborate with you? Right? I still remember when Blinken visited China, he met with President Xi Jinping, and supposedly he asked China for help for the Ukraine war, right? And Xi Jinping had one question that's opening, okay? We have to first 搞清楚, make it clear whether we are friends, right? That is, if you accept us as it is, politically, right? If you cannot assure that you accept our political system, we're not going to collaborate. Right? That's kind of the way I understand it.
I would be the last person to say that America has been a good partner with China. In the 1990s, we were a good partner with China. We helped you develop. And in fact, in the 1990s, we had almost a global peace after the end of the Cold War. The problem we ran into in 2000 happened right here in Orange County, actually. There was a report published, it's called the Cox Report on Chinese espionage. It was published in 1999. Christopher Cox was the congressional representative of this district. And in that report, he criticized American companies for being in bed with Chinese, and also blamed Chinese espionage for a lot of the problems. Now, the purpose of that report was to build a case against Al Gore in 2000. And that report and that pivot toward China worked for that election. The good news is we have more elections, and as bad as things get in this country, we can get back to cooperation. But I'm looking forward to the rest of this year. I can report, I looked at the trade statistics just over the weekend. And basically, the two countries' trade relationship in all respects fell by about 30%. Foxconn is producing Apple telephones now in Vietnam, and so Vietnam got more important in our scheme of relationships. But I think we've got too many common problems not to collaborate. Climate is one. We both have a terrible demographic problem. Old people like me are breaking our social system. You have a worse problem in China, the demographics. So we ought to be working on research in Alzheimer's and diseases of the elderly, like blindness. That's one of my afflictions. But we don't seem to be able to do that. And I'm not blaming China so much as I'm blaming our own fellow Americans. We ought to be paying attention to getting ideas from other countries. And that is happening, but I think we should encourage it rather than, obviously, your 5-year plan is set, but the timing of setting that plan is considering the idea that Trump will continue, and he's not going to continue. That'll change. And I hope your policies in China can change along with that change.
Actually, I want to move away from the democracy, non-democracy. I want to disabuse you of the notion that that is the only barrier. Of course, there are people like Pompeo, I hear you, for whom it is. Let me move out of that domain, because you spoke about China developing its own economy. You reiterated something that has been repeated very frequently on self-sufficiency for the last decade and more. You spoke of Deng Xiaoping, reform and opening. So your excellent presentation provided a logic behind this emphasis on continued emphasis on manufacturing, that, by the way, is to the detriment, not high-tech manufacturing, but you continue also lower tech manufacturing that really deprives the industrializing world from developing the way that you, China, did. But that's a side story. What I mean is that you provided a logic of manufacturing, innovation, technological upgrading, and many of us know that story. But that story also has a logic that jives with another colleague of yours, Albert Hirschman. You may have come upon his seminal work on how some states purposefully build industrial concentration under economic protection to exploit economic asymmetries and coerce outcomes. Now, China is not the only state that has embarked on strategies of that nature. And very few thought that China was even in that domain under Deng Xiaoping. John mentioned things were very favorable for US-China cooperation, the Charm Offensive, and the world was thrilled with enhancing global supply chains, shared technology, and see China rise. So the logic of confrontation wasn't there, and we need to understand why that strategy was derailed, because it was working well for China, right? You said at some point it needed to be changed, but it changed in the direction of a Hirschmanian strategy that, in the view of some of us, works less well for China than the previous strategy. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm turning it off. Yeah, I'm turning it off. Is it okay if I? Yeah. Okay. So I think I see an irony in this shift away from policies under Deng Xiaoping, frankly, because Deng argued that China should pacify the outside world so that it could draw the resources that were needed from abroad, that were needed for China to focus on building a strong domestic economy. And that policy worked miracles. China would never have gotten to where it is today without Deng Xiaoping and that policy. But more recently, this sort of shift into this Hirschmanian strategy, I think, has done the reverse. It has alienated many partners and undermined domestic economic strength. I have an enchilada, and I don't know if you know what enchilada is. It's a food that we like in California, but a long list of things having to do with personal consumption in China and welfare and antipathy to welfare policies in China. But the point is the irony for me is that this China policy seems to be doing the reverse. It actually is not oriented to building more strength. For one, China has a Gini index of income distribution that is as bad as ours, okay? Not a very good example for the rest of the world. Anyways, let me stop there.
Well, I think I actually fully agree with you too. Almost every word, right? But the problem is that we live in reality. You are talking about kind of an ideal world, right? As an economist, I always tell my students to become an economist, you have to learn to think like a god, right? You always use the God sweep to think about the whole world, trying to improve the welfare of everyone. But for politicians, they have different views, different angles, right? So for Chinese leaders, I think the most urgent thing is reunification. Okay, that's the most urgent thing. Right. So let's say already set this goal. Then all the other things have to serve that goal. Okay, and politicians always set up goals first, right? And then you guys to find the stepstones toward that goal. Okay. So, you think about 49, it seems like, oh, we still have 25 years, right? But 25 years are really short, okay? So for them, there is a kind of urgency, okay? Actually, the Chinese government already said there's the opening, right? We cannot postpone the solution indefinitely, which means they're going to solve this problem in their generation. It means only like 10 years, 20 years at the most, right? So that's kind of the reality in China. Okay? I think we have to wait until we settle down on Taiwan issue before we start any serious building like rule of law, kind of thinking about the other countries.
Can I get this back on? I can't see it to turn it on. What's that?
That's good.
Yeah, okay, so I'm talking about reality. And in order to get to peace, in order to get to prosperity, you need to have imagination. And so imagination is really important. And I want to say two things about Taiwan. One is, you've already captured Taiwan. If you look at the ties of trade between the three countries, actually, it would be crazy to start a fight. You can see what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, a win is going to be they're going to win a pile of rubble or even gravel. They've dropped so many bombs there. It just makes no sense when you have a good economic relationship. You know, the heart of that is the cell phone in my pocket and Foxconn and all that relationship. The other thing I'll say real quickly, if you look at American history, twice in American history, we tried to take Canada. We marched soldiers up there twice, and we failed. I think the only win we had was in the Olympics last night. We were beaten back, and what worked was a charm offensive. And I wrote a paper back in 2007 suggesting that some of the events in the 2008 Olympics, you ought to have rowing on Sun Moon Lake in Taiwan, make that offer. I know you've given them pandas, but, and taken it back in some cases. But I think there's other approaches. And, you know, the other thing about Taiwan is mainland China hasn't controlled Taiwan for 100 years. So why not wait another 10 or 20 and see how this marriage, this economic marriage can develop? I'm sorry if I'm being a big critic right now, but
No.
you're talking about that. Your presentation was super interesting. I appreciate that. And it's my major problem with it is you're making these policies in this crazy situation with the United States, which I really believe is temporary. So anyway, I'll be quiet.
This one is not working, so I'm gonna speak without it.
Probably use this one.
We're cooperating on the
See? Thank you. So I'm actually going back to economics, okay? I'm the only non-economist, I guess, here, but so yeah, there is the because I do want to impress on you that, you know, if we focus on Taiwan on this, maybe I should, given sort of my own field, I would have been the one focusing on Taiwan, but I'm not. I'm focusing on barriers to cooperation, not just with the US, but with the rest of the world. So your argument, and I quote, focused on, you say, personal consumption is clearly an inefficient strategy. Let me give you the rubric of what I'm going to say in the next couple minutes. I think China will have to make a choice. And I say this on the basis of what many economists, dovish economists, okay, not anti-China, not what you might consider, you know, the anti-China crowd, that China will have to make a choice: overcapacity or genuine Chinese prosperity, overcapacity or deflation. You know, China fears Japanification, I heard, but Japan's stalled economy actually took place under conditions of much, much better Gini index of income distribution at the time. Japan had already arrived in terms of a welfare society. So I want to go back to personal consumption because you think it's an inefficient strategy. But should policy not go beyond simple presumed inefficiency and consider that the average Chinese citizen must fend for themselves by saving in the absence of any kind of safety net, real safety net from the government? Ignoring domestic consumption also fuels something that I'm sure you've heard among your peers in economics, this doom loop. Actually, S.R. Prasad just published the book, The Doom Loop, right? That many economists defined, and I'll give you the mechanism that they that has everything to do with production. Because of weak domestic consumption, which you think should stay the way it is in some ways, China boosts manufacturing investment, which in turn creates overcapacity, that has to be exported to the rest of the world, triggering this global tariff retaliation, not just from the US, but from many other countries, which in turn weakens domestic demand further, right? Which prompts more manufacturing stimulus of the kind you spoke in here. And there's this vicious cycle that goes on, which they call the doom loop. So can China get out of that cycle in a way that not only benefits the majority of Chinese people, because these are not lazy people. These are people that have made China wealthy and great. So the issue of overcapacity, I think, is looming very large in China's relation with the rest of the world, much more maybe than, you know, things that I think could be worked out. Let me stop there. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, for economists in China, we all believe that Chinese industries have overcapacity. That's for sure. If we only look at the China's domestic market, okay, deflation is a huge problem. So that's why I just said the fundamental collaboration between China and the United States, or China and the EU, is for the United States and the EU to open the door to Chinese investment, right? I talk with my American friends, European friends, they always say, oh no, we are not going to depend on China, right? If we allow Chinese investment into our country, we are going to depend on you guys, okay? We want to de-risk, right? And relying on China is going to pose a huge risk to our domestic economy. But the problem is that today, China is becoming the manufacturing powerhouse in the whole world. Professor Graham just said, you know, the U.S.-China trade has plummeted. But my guess is that if you look at the American imports, break up them and check the orange, right, out of those parts, I think the United States' reliance on China has not declined. It has to be increasing because there's no way for the United States to escape China. Right? You can escape China directly, but you have to import from Mexico, from Vietnam, from India. And look at what those countries import hugely from China. It's because the Chinese investment all go to those countries, right? So if that's the case, why doesn't the United States just open the door for Chinese companies to invest in here? I mean, Chinese companies love to invest in the United States. I talk with our graduates, many of them actually invest in the United States, but they're really small. They tell me it's very easy to do business in the United States, right? Because our legal framework is fair playing ground, right? And also, Chinese companies now have better technologies, okay? Right? But of course, that's the problem, right? While my students told me, actually, they are not to bring the most advanced technology to the United States because they had the fear that the U.S. government would chase on him. Okay, so that's the problem. Okay, I mean, yeah, China is always investing domestically, but if you think about the global economy, I don't think that China has over-invested. China is exporting inflation to other countries, but on the flip side, China is exporting its own capacity to the whole world. China is contributing to other countries. I also, talked with my European friends, the same thing. It's so hard today for United States and the European countries to take this idea, right? But if you reject the Chinese companies, the only thing that's going to happen is that you are going to be more relying on China through trade. Look at Germany. That's a perfect example. Germany used to have a huge surplus, trade surplus with China. Today, China last year ran $80 billion trade surplus with Germany. Okay, and look at the German companies; they all moved to China. Right. Recently, I did a program with the CGTN. I pretend to be an anchor. I interview German companies. So, wow, the German company with Henkel. Right. Henkel is now investing heavily into China. Okay, because China can provide the human capital, the production network, and also the know-how for them to innovate from China. Okay, so this is not just a problem of China. If we can sit down and talk about the solution to this, right? That's the start of a cooperation. Right? That's the basic.
I guess I have to say, maybe the biggest part of the problem is Americans' fear of China. And that's really cultivated beginning in 2000. And it just continues. And American politicians like using fear appeals. And so in that sense, I'm ashamed of my own country, that we're susceptible to fear appeals. But I guess my bottom line is what you were saying about the 5-year plan is it's just gonna feed it more, feed the fear. And I think that's dangerous. We don't have time to talk about nuclear weapons. We don't have time to talk about Russia and how each country feels about Russia. Maybe that we'll have time for that later on. But my fears have to do with, I mentioned World War II and the horrific consequences of that. And we ought to be able to imagine a better place where we collaborate on common problems. And I'll be quiet.
So I'm sorry to have to cut in, especially on.
Can I just do the last?
Oh, sure, yes. Go.
Because I so much agree with John. By the way, we may be dovish, but we are rooted in reality. Let me, I'm gonna address the last, thank you so much. No problem. You're right that there are barriers, and I think you should be aware of the de-risking strategy has a reason. And I'm glad you invoked the Russia thing. First of all, for a country that runs such a closed shop for so many years to argue that others have to open the doors to Chinese investment, it's a little rich. But there is another reason for this, what you call mistrust, and this emphasis on de-risking that I think will continue, especially in Europe. And that has to do with another major mistake, in my humble opinion, that the Chinese government made in endorsing Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. I was actually in Berlin at the time of the war, and I can tell you that there was a widespread view that the shock was not just the invasion by Putin, but China's response to it. It lingers on everything you're talking about regarding Taiwan and all that. I was having a conversation with a Chinese colleague and friend, and I was saying, you know, if China actually does not endorse Putin's invasion, it can come out of this 2022 smelling like a rose. It would have been a coup. You know, it would have been like a sequel to the Charm Offensive. But instead it did the other way. So the risk and the pushback that you were going to feel on investment and so on has everything to do, in Europe more than in the US, with that alliance with Putin. That I still can't find a good logical kind of rational, I am rooted in reality, a rational explanation other than a deeply political one within China.
And I don't know if you want
No,
to finish?
no,
I was hoping that we can ask the audience, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but I think we have time for maybe 2 questions for Professor Yao. So if you put your hands up, and maybe we'll just take them one after the other.
Well, I studied China for about 60 years, so I tend to be sympathetic to China. But I wonder about reunification with Taiwan. Now, you emphasize China as a socialist country. Taiwan's a democratic country. So how will that work politically? And especially given what happened in Hong Kong with the basic law being overridden. In other words, no change until the late 40s that promise was not kept.
If there's another question. Right here, Anne. Right in front of you.
Like you mentioned that China is trying to get back to the 1950s, which is the fact, and all the Chinese people know what that means. So to what extent do you think that is related to the personal desire of the Chinese leader, and is it likely to be true?
Well, nowadays in China, peaceful reunification is very much the first option. Right? So Chinese leaders began to talk about this, particularly Wang Huning. I think 2 or 3 months ago, he published an article, a really long article, talking about the peaceful reunification. And why peaceful reunification is good for people in Taiwan. Okay, I think he listed the 7 good things for Taiwan people. In terms of the system, it's negotiable. If we talk about Deng Xiaoping, right? Deng Xiaoping actually started in the 1980s. After reunification, Taiwan can even keep its army. And we can also think about kind of reclaiming China. Okay, but of course, the 40 years have passed, right? But I believe there can be some solutions that both sides will accept. Reunification is not just the desire of the leader, right? It's, you ask the Chinese people, I bet at least 80% of Chinese people will agree. Right? When I talk about there's at least one occurrence inside China, the audience said, "Oh, for reunification, does the government need a donation? We are going to donate." Right? So probably it's hard for people outside China to think about unified China is so important, right? And China was unified by Qin Shi Huang more than 2,000 years ago. And in the last 2,000 years, there were periods of disintegration. And people remember in those periods, Chinese people suffered. Okay? So, the integrity of the territory, I would also say, is in the blood of Chinese people. Okay? Right? Outsiders just cannot appreciate this. So that's why if the goal is for reunification, I believe Chinese people will say, hey, so what? We can take the cost. Okay. But of course, I don't think eventually, China will allow to resort to forces. Right? Peaceful reunification is still the first priority.
This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Please join me again in thanking our distinguished speaker, Professor Yao Yang, and also our panel. To invite the panel to take your seats again.